Today I'm going to look at the books of Leviticus and Numbers in the Old Testament. This continues a series of lectures on the books of the Old Testament. And first of all, we come to the book of Leviticus, or as we know it, the book that destroys Bible reading plans every year. But Leviticus, it's a book that means matters pertaining to the Levites. And so the focus is going to be on the priests and the worship and laws surrounding worship that guides Israel in how to live as a holy nation before a holy God. As you think about the purpose of the book is to instruct Israel on how to maintain faithful fellowship with God through sacrifices, priesthood, and ritual piety. So this book is foreign to us in the modern era. Now, we don't think about sacrifices, and we don't think about priesthood unless we're Roman Catholic. Particularly evangelical Protestants would not think of the priesthood in these terms. Nor do we really think about ritual purity. So when we come to a book like Leviticus, sometimes we get confused. Are we to hold on to these traditions? Is this to be part of what we do as evangelicals moving forward, or is there a different purpose for it? And as we look at the book, it's divided up. And the first really main section that we come to is chapters 1 through 7, which deal with the sacrifices. And there are 5 main offerings that are described here, and they are emphasized for ritual performance rather than theological explanation. You have the burnt offerings that are spoken of in chapter 1, and then later on in chapter 6, verses 8 through 13. And the purpose of these is to atone for sin and the restoration of fellowship. The procurement has to deal with the entire animal being burnt, and this symbolizing full dedication to God. The significance of that is that the worshiper identifies with the animal in this case. And there are socioeconomic considerations, meaning what type of animal varies by the person's means. Sometimes it varies by the degree of which sin takes place. But if someone is very poor, they may offer a grain offering. If someone is very rich, they may bring an entire bull to be sacrificed and slaughtered there at the altar as an offering for sin. Then you do have the grain offerings, and this is a tribute to God. The meaning here that is placed in these grain offerings, you see this in chapter 2, and then later on in chapter 6, verses 14 through 23. The rules are that no yeast nor honey, because this symbolizes decay, and salt always is included in these. And salt, of course, is that symbol of the enduring covenant with God. And then you have the fellowship or peace offerings in chapter 3, and then later on chapter 7, verses 11 through 21. This is a share of a meal between God, priest, and worshiper. And also you have the symbol here of peace, gratitude, fellowship with God and with his people. Then later you have the discussion of the sin offering in chapter 4, verses 1 through the entire chapter into chapter 5 to verse 13. Then you have chapter 6, verses 24 through 30, and the purpose here is the atonement for ritual impurity and unintentional sins. This represents purification and restoration in ritual cleanness. So there is much ritual that is taking place here. Then the last major offering for this section of sacrifices of verses or chapters 1 through 7 has to deal with the guilt offering. And this is found in chapter 5, verses 14 through chapter 6, verse 7, and then you see it again in chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. This is for the violations of sacred things involving restitution plus a 20% penalty, and it symbolizes restoration and justice before God. So that's the first main section of the book of Leviticus deals with those very things. It deals with the sacrifices, and we find that in chapters 1 through 7. And then the priesthood is spoken of in chapters 8 through 10. This is culminated with the ordination of Aaron and his sons and the consecration through atonement and sacrifice. And then their roles are spelled out. They're to be the mediator between God and Israel. And then you have this tragedy that takes place in chapter 10, verses 1 through 3, with the priest Nahab and Abihu offering unauthorized fire or false fire before God, and they are consumed by divine fire. And this illustrates the holiness and danger of the presence of God. They didn't take it seriously, and so God does something about that and sends a message through the death of Nahab and Abihu. Then the next major section of the book of Leviticus, you have chapters 11 through 16, and the purpose here is to maintain ritual cleanliness for worship and community life. The primary areas of concern are food laws in chapter 11, childbirth in chapter 12, skin diseases and mildew in chapters 13 and 14, with a focus on the wholeness of the individual, not necessarily the hygiene. And then bodily discharges in chapter 15, and the contact with fluids of life renders one unclean. That's why so many in that day that worked with those who were dead and disposed of the dead were considered to be unclean because of the bodily discharges, and among other things. The principles are reflected here, the reflection of order, wholeness, and the life-death distinction. Plus, there's a great deal of emphasis on blood, and it's representing life and holiness. And then the Day of Atonement is spoken of in chapter 16, and this is the day in which the high priest enters the Holy of Holies that one time of year, and there's ritual purification for the sins of Israel, and the scapegoat, which carries away the sins of the nation, is spoken of in chapter 16, verse 10. The next section has to deal with the Holiness Code, and this is chapters 17 through 27. And the theme here is to be holy, because God is holy. Even we have those stated multiple times. Be holy, for I, the Lord, am holy. And the focus here is on everyday holiness, moral, social, ceremonial purity, with also regulations, holiness in worship and sexuality and social justice in festivals, and the priestly holiness is emphasized in chapters 21 through 22 and 24. And then the goal ultimately is Israel's distinctiveness as God's covenant people. They have to understand that they are a distinctive people. They are not like other nations, although they'll forget that later on, won't they? The authorship of Leviticus is, again, contributed to Moses. Moses writing the first 5 books, this being the third of the 5 that we find here. And the Holiness Code, there at the end of Leviticus, may have existed in a separate collection, but was integrated into Leviticus later on. Could be when some of those councils and were put together and the canonization process took place. There is thought and idea that they were separate but inserted later. As far as the genre of this book, you're dealing with primarily law, with a brief section of historical narrative found in chapters 8 through 10. And then part of it is really a theological history of God's covenant dealing with Israel. And what about its theological significance and the anticipation of the gospel moving forward? Well, understand that ultimately the gospel is the good news concerning Jesus Christ, and so in this, Jesus fulfills the law set out in Leviticus. He's the ultimate sacrifice, which is reiterated later on in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 1 through 18. He is the perfect high priest. Again, Hebrews chapter 4, verses 14 through chapter 5, verse 10. And his death abolished ritual purity laws, and it, of course, tears down the wall between Jew and Gentile. This is spoken of in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 14 through 18. This call to holiness continues, and so it's later on picked up by Peter, who was himself Jewish, who no doubt was familiar with the book of Leviticus. And when believers are indwelt with the Holy Spirit, they are to be holy as God is holy, just like those who in Israel were in that time in which Leviticus was written. So what's the key theme or key thematic summary for the book? It is that a holy God dwells among his holy people through sacrifice and purity. That is the summation of the book of Leviticus. But what about the next book next to it? That is the book of Numbers. What is Numbers about? Well, really it's a census. It's 2 censuses that take place, one in chapter 1, one in chapter 26. And the purpose is to explain Israel's 40-year wandering in the wilderness. And it's a record of the transition from the first generation, the unbelieving generation, those who would die without entering into the promised land, without having entered into the promised land, and then the second generation, who was the faithful generation, who would indeed enter into the promised land. And the structure of the book, and also some geography that needs to be explained as well. It starts really at Sinai, the mountain. And in verse 1 of chapter 1 through verse 10 of chapter 10, there's a preparation for departure that is taking place here, a census and a camp organization in chapters 1 and 2, Levite duties in chapters 3 and 4, laws and purity in chapters 5 and 6, and then offerings at the tabernacle matters also in chapter 7 through chapter 10, verse 10. And so they begin their journey, and they go from Sinai to Kadesh. This is chapter 10, verses 11 through chapter 20, verses 13. There is rebellion, judgment, and leadership challenges. There's complaints about food, this murmuring that takes place in chapter 11. Then there's Miriam and Aaron opposing Moses in chapter 12, the spies report that takes place, and Israel's unbelief captured in 13 through 14, and God decrees death for the first generation. And then there is the Korah's rebellion in chapter 16 and 17, and Moses' sin at Meribah in chapter 20, verses 1 through 13. And so there is a wilderness wandering that is taking place here, and they will continue to wander for quite some time. Then in chapter 20, verse 14 through chapter 36, verse 13, they'll go from Kadesh to Moab. And victory and renewed hope takes place here. You have the Balaam narrative that takes place in chapters 22 through 24. And God compels blessing, not cursing. And then Israel's sin with Midianite women in chapter 25. The second census that takes place in chapter 26, which is the counting of the next generation, the new generation to be counted, the one that will go into the promised land, and then preparations for entering into Canaan. And that's going to happen in chapters 31 through 36 of the book of Numbers. Major themes throughout the book, well, this is the transition period from generations, from a disobedient generation to an obedient generation, from one who is obstinate to one who is hopeful. And so there's a transition of generations taking place here. There is divine presence and guidance, how God remains with his people in spite of their sin. And then there's leadership and rebellion. There's real human failure, and that's contrasted with the faithfulness of God. Judgment and grace. There is sin that brings discipline, but God's covenant mercy continues with the people. I mean, why didn't God just strike them all dead? Well, that would not fulfill his promise that he made to Abraham. It would have been right for him to do so. Well, they rebelled. Of course, a few were faithful. But God is God. But yet, God does judge, does bring discipline because of sin, yet he is still merciful and faithful. And it shows in the book of Numbers. Authorship, again, having to do with Moses, this being part of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. So the authorship is contributed to Moses, and he would have been there to write a first-hand account. And then you have a continuation of the Exodus, Leviticus narrative that takes place here in this book regarding authorship. Almost to say, it seems as if the same person is writing all of these books, because you can tell based on the language that is used that there is consistency in authorship. Genre, well, it's theological history combined with narrative and law, more narrative than particularly the book of Leviticus. It is describing historical events to teach theological truths about God's covenant and his holiness. And there is great theological significance to the book of Numbers, because it also, like the book of Leviticus, anticipates the coming of the Messiah. God remains faithful despite the rebellion of human beings, and Christ is that fulfillment, because he is the faithful one. He is the chosen one. But like Israel, Christ's journey in obedience through testing And so Israel goes through a time of testing, wandering in the wilderness, and Christ himself doesn't spend 40 years, but does spend 40 days in the wilderness, and this could be found before he preaches that great sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, beginning in Matthew chapter 5. But in Matthew chapter 4, you see the testing of Jesus in the wilderness by Satan and the suffering that he went through there. You have God's presence and provision in the wilderness, and this foreshadows Christ's redemption later on. And you have the Balaam prophecy in Numbers 24, verse 17. This anticipates the coming of the Messianic King, and ultimately we know the Messianic King to be Jesus. And so what's the lesson for believers, if there is any kind of theological significance? Well, it's that each generation must respond in faith and obedience to God's redemptive work. See, these things are handed down to an extent, but the faith of one generation is not going to save the next generation. Each generation must make a renewal, and to have their faith ultimately in the one who can save, and that is Jesus. So my grandmother's faith is not going to save me. My mother's faith is not going to save me. Grandfather's faith is not going to save me. Father's faith is not going to save me. It's going to be my own faith and the finished work of Jesus Christ that is the one that saves me. What's the key theme as we summarize the book of Numbers? It's God's faithful presence guides his people from rebellion to renewal. And that, in one summarized statement, is the book of Numbers. So what are some practical and theological applications that we can take away from the book? Well, first, it's faith and obedience, trusting God's promises even when the journey is hard. And for them, the journey was hard, and they grumbled at times, but ultimately God is faithful. So we must ourselves be faithful and obedient to God, even when it seems dark, even when it seems that there is no end to this journey, yet we know there is an end, and our ultimate end is to be with him. There's some practical application in leadership accountability, that spiritual leaders must honor God publicly. You see certain things taking place, even in the life of Moses in this book, and he is chastised greatly for it. There is God's covenant mercy that is on display here. Even when punished, God's people are not forsaken. He loves to chasten those whom he loves, because the chastening is what makes us the people we are to be. That's what God does for us. He chastens those whom he loves. And I would rather be chastened, disciplined by God, than to be left to my own devices and end up in a place where I should not be and do not want to be. God is faithful, even when chastening those whom he loves. And the hope and renewal that is on display here, that God raises up a new generation to fulfill his purposes. May God raise up another generation, a new generation, that he can use for his honor and for his glory. And these are the books of Leviticus and Numbers. Thank you.